Hey, sixth grade, this is Mr. Fraser, and today is Wednesday, April 15th. Today's your history lecture on continuing on the Middle Ages. We left off talking about the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to continue talking about that. Today we're going to talk about how the church influenced political events or governments, and then also how the church was changed by outside events, most notably the Protestant Reformation. So let's just dive right in. This is a new quarter, so we are starting with a clean slate. You have tests coming up. Please be mindful of like rough due dates. I'm trying to be pretty lenient about when things get turned in. But we do have we got to take our tests. We got to keep on doing school as best we can. So you guys have a science test this Friday. All of you should have gotten your books from school, and that included test booklets. You can just write on the tests and then take a picture and either add it to Dropbox, but if that doesn't work, email them to me or text them to me. I don't care. I'll take them any way I can get them, but just try and get them to me as soon as possible. All right, let us dive right in. So the Holy Roman Empire that we talked about last time is kind of this large kingdom in the middle of Europe. And after the fall of Western Rome, you will see that the Germanic tribes that established new kingdoms are kind of still looking back to Rome to get some legitimacy. They want to emulate this great empire that once, ruled the world. But on the religious side, even though the empire falls, the church that was set up by Constantine remains. So you have the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who's kind of the head of everything, right? So Constantine said Rome is the center of the world, and Peter was the Bishop of Rome. Therefore, the Bishop of Rome got its authority from Jesus, and has every Bishop of Rome is basically like Peter's successor. And today, we're going to talk about how they had so much power that they could create their own armies, which is exactly what the Crusades were. Now, there's a medieval painting of crusaders. The Crusades were a series of wars fought between Christian armies and Muslim armies for the Holy Land. Now, when I say the word Holy Land, that means basically modern-day Israel and Lebanon, the territory where Jesus and his disciples would have walked around. So Jerusalem is like the big major spot because that's where Jesus did most of his preaching and was crucified and resurrected. But, Nazareth, Galilee, Bethlehem, all of these areas where Paul and Peter and the rest of them do all of the things from the New Testament. And having control of them was not only important, like theologically, we'll see, but it was also important economically. You could make a lot of money if you could control those territories. So the Crusaders are people who took up the cross to fight the enemies of Jesus. I'm using air quotes, you can't see it right now. Or that means Muslims, basically. But people who were not part of the Christian faith. In fact, the word crusaders comes from the Latin word for cross. Now, back in the day, we're going to talk a little bit about this. Today, if you do something sinful, you say or think something sinful, you ask Jesus for forgiveness, you move right along. The Catholic Church is different. Not only do you have to go to a church and confess your sins to a priest, but then you would have some kind of penance that you would have to do in order to be forgiven. So just saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, that wasn't good enough. And depending on the severity of your crime, your sin, depended on how big your penance would have to be. And it could be anything. It could be paying money. It could be, whipping yourself. It could be, fasting, it could be any number of things, including going on a pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is a long trip for religious purposes. Now, today we know that like you could pray in your room or in the church or in Jerusalem, it's all the same. But for the Catholic mind back in the Middle Ages, the closer you were to a holy place, the more powerful your prayer. So if you could go to where the Pope was, well, that's going to be more powerful than in your house. And the most powerful place, obviously, would be like Bethlehem or Golgotha, where Jesus died for sins. And so Christians would go to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. And this was before, like, planes and boats. So it was a big, well, not before boats, but it was a big deal to get over there. And things have been going on like this for 1,000 years. Until in 1070, when the Ottoman Turks captured Jerusalem and they closed it off to Christians. Now, this was a big deal because not only were the Christians insulted by this, but they thought, well, we can't get to Jerusalem to pray for our sins, and if we can't do that, then we could not get to heaven. And so they were willing to fight for it. Now, Pope Urban II calls a sermon, and in the sermon he says, those dirty infidels are holding Jerusalem, and they're holding the place of Christ's birth and death, and we need to have this holy war to take it back. And he says this famous phrase, Deus vult, God wills it. And hundreds, thousands of people hear this sermon as he goes around preaching and drop everything. Some of them are just regular dudes. There's even a children's crusade at one point. But knights take up the cross and they head to the Holy Land to fight. Now, in 8th grade, we're going to talk more about them because the Crusades are a big, big deal. But the Crusades have immediate impacts and they have lasting impacts. There is a medieval painting of people going on crusade, and you can see they have the cross on their banners and on their spears and on their shields. They're taking up the cross to go fight for the Lord. Now, the Christians actually take the Holy Land, hundreds of miles away, surrounded by enemies. They manage to get it and take it. And when they take Jerusalem, they kill all the Muslims they can find. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible scene. But they have it, and there's Christian kingdoms in the Middle East for over 100 years. And the rest of the Crusades are, kind of this series of conflicts as the Muslims try to retake Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, and Europeans send in reinforcements. And it's bloody, bloody battles, and there's a whole big deal that we're going to talk more about in 8th grade, but we don't have the time today. But one of the lasting impacts that they had is that Europe, Western Europe, had been cut off from Asia following the fall of Western Rome. The Muslims and the Byzantines were still trading with places like India and China for silk and tea and all of these luxury items, spices. But during the aftermath of the fall of Rome, Western Europe was kind of cut off. They were in their own kind of turmoil, and they didn't have the connections or the communication or really the ability to get to these luxury goods, and so they forgot about many of them. But when the Crusaders, after they take Jerusalem, many of them come back. Some of them are rich from, stealing all the booty. But they come back and they have traded for, spices, for silk, for tea. And word gets around that, that there are these luxury goods. And so the Crusades, in a way, spark the idea that Columbus will later have of trying to get to India to get all these spices, because when Crusaders go to the Holy Land, they start trading with people. Even in war, people trade, making money, right? So they reconnect Western Europe with what at the time was called the Orient, India, China, the East. And people became interested in trade and travel back east instead of just amongst Western Europe. And so the Crusades start a direct line from 10, 1100 all the way to 1500, Columbus and the Renaissance and all of that begins with these crusades a couple hundred years earlier. All right, what else? So we're going to talk mostly about the Protestant Reformation today. It's a big, big deal in history, especially European history, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. So during the Middle Ages and even before that, during the Roman times, people were not allowed access to the Bible like we are today. In fact, during the Middle Ages, most people couldn't read. The Catholic Church made sure that all Bibles were in Latin. It's called the Vulgate. That was the name of the Latin Bible. And so most people were illiterate, and even if they could read, it's in another language. So the church had control of the biblical story. And so if you were a person who was accepting Jesus into your heart, you couldn't read the Bible and pray and figure out these truths for yourself. You had to go to the church to be told how to get into heaven. And so the church had absolute control over the Bible, over what it said, over the gospel, and over quote unquote salvation. So if you wanted to get into heaven, well, you had to do what the church said. So if the church said you have to work on these lands, well, you had to work on the lands. If the church said you couldn't do this or you could do that, you did what the church said. It was absolute authority and control. It was not like the church that many of you probably go to, where you're singing praise songs and having a good time. This was a big, big deal. The church was huge. It was rich. It was powerful. And so if you couldn't read the Bible, if you didn't know what it said, well, then how could you ever question the church? The church says, this is how you get to heaven. Well, you just did what they said. But after hundreds of years, there were people who were starting to figure out that it wasn't just the way the Catholic Church said. And some of them started to challenge the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church came down on them really hard. But the two things that challenge the church that lead to the Protestant Reformation, number one, is information being spread. People are getting their hands on the Bible and reading it for themselves. But number two is that the Catholic Church becomes so corrupt that people can see the hypocrisy, that it's incorrect, it's the wrong way to do things. So here we have, come on. Why is my iPad not working? Alright, well, I guess I will make another video about the Protestant Reformation, and I will post that later. Sorry about this. I hope you guys have a great day. Goodbye.